Li Hua had always been the kind of photographer who prided himself on capturing the world as it was, or, more precisely, as he saw it. His studio was a cluttered chaos of mismatched furniture, half-empty coffee mugs, and vintage cameras stacked like trophies from long-forgotten shoots. His creativity was wild, always seeking to bend light and shadow into something surreal, something unexpected. He wasn't the type to settle for a simple portrait or a standard landscape. No, Li Hua needed more. He wanted the strange, the uncanny, the art that made people stop and question what they were looking at. It was a typical Thursday morning when everything changed. Li Hua had been setting up for an experimental photo shoot, attempting to capture the moment light collided with the human form in ways never seen before. The idea was simple enough: use mirrors and custom-built light rigs to create impossible reflections. He wasn't exactly a physicist, but in his world, light had its own rules. But something went wrong. The light, which was supposed to dance gracefully across the reflective surfaces, instead exploded in a flurry of brilliance. There was a hum, like an electrical storm was about to unleash, and then a pulse, an overwhelming burst of light. For a split second, everything in the room turned white. Li Hua blinked rapidly, his eyes stinging as the brightness overwhelmed him. He stumbled back, feeling his way through the darkness that followed the light's assault. When his vision cleared, he found himself staring at something utterly bizarre. There, in the full-length mirror on the wall, stood him. But it wasn't really him. Not exactly. The version of himself in the mirror was standing tall, calm, almost serene. His posture was perfect, his clothes immaculate, his face free of the usual stress and fatigue that Li Hua had grown so accustomed to seeing in the reflection of his daily life. The mirror version was smiling, just a little, a hint of smugness curling the corners of his lips. He was, in every way, too perfect. A version of himself Li Hua had always dreamed of being, perhaps, but never had the patience to cultivate. Great, Li Hua muttered under his breath, rubbing his eyes. Now I'm hallucinating. He turned away from the mirror, trying to shake the weirdness off. But when he glanced back, the reflection was still there. This time, though, it wasn't just a mirror image. It moved. The other Li Hua stretched, running a hand through his hair as if he were a different person entirely. Okay, that's it, Li Hua said, stepping forward, reaching out to touch the glass. The moment his fingers made contact with the cold surface, the reflection did the same. But then, it winked at him. He stumbled back, breath hitching in his chest. Was this some kind of joke? Was someone playing a prank on him? But no one else was in the room. He checked the studio door, locked, just as it had been when he entered. He looked back at the mirror. His reflection was still there, smiling, waiting. It seemed to be enjoying this. Li Hua's fingers hovered over his phone. He snapped a picture of the mirror, expecting the light to distort or reveal something strange. After all, it wasn't like he hadn't captured impossible things before. But the photo, when he checked it, was pristine. Everything was in focus, the lighting perfect, and his reflection? No changes. Frustration bubbled up inside him. He was a professional. He understood light. He could bend it, manipulate it, control it to create the surreal images he was known for. But this? This was something else. He grabbed a nearby camera, snapping photo after photo, hoping for some sign of what had gone wrong. But each shot was more perfect than the last. The image of him in the mirror, too perfect, too pristine. The more he stared, the more unnerved he became. What was it about this image that seemed so alive? It wasn't long before the mirror itself began to change. Li Hua was staring at the glass, his mind trying to process what was happening, when the reflection suddenly bent in on itself. For just a moment, the version of him in the mirror flickered, and when it reappeared, his reflection was standing in a different place. But it wasn't a simple trick of the light. No, it was as if the mirror had shifted entirely. The version of him in the glass had moved, not by any obvious means, but with a fluidity that should have been impossible. He closed his eyes for a moment, thinking maybe it was the light, just a trick, some sort of visual distortion. But when he opened them again, the reflection was still there, moving of its own accord, smiling at him, as though waiting for something. Li Hua stepped back slowly, his mind racing. He reached for the nearest chair and sat down, staring at the mirror like it held the answers to a riddle he couldn't solve. And then, as if answering his silent question, the reflection spoke. "You're losing control," the mirror version said. Its voice was almost a mockery of his own, clear, confident, self-assured. "You always did, didn't you? Couldn't keep up with your own ideas. You've always wanted perfection, and now you've got it." Li Hua blinked, frozen. That wasn't possible. He hadn't said anything aloud. "What do you mean?" he finally managed, his voice hoarse. The reflection gave a sly smile, as if it had been waiting for him to ask. "You wanted power. You wanted to shape the world around you. But you can't even control yourself, can you?" Li Hua's pulse quickened. "You're not real. You're just a reflection. A trick." The mirror version laughed softly, a sound that seemed to echo around the room, filling it with an unnerving presence. "You can keep telling yourself that," it said, "but what if I told you you are the illusion? What if the world you've built, the world you think you control, is just the reflection?" The words hit Li Hua like a slap. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the idea. It was impossible. He was in control of his own reality, his own perceptions. But deep down, he knew something had shifted. The accident with the lights, the strange moment in the mirror, it wasn't just a freak occurrence. This was different. The reflection was right. Something was off. Li Hua's mind raced as he stared at his reflection. The mockery in its smile, the calm assurance in its posture, it was everything he hated about himself, everything he'd never been. His hand trembled as he reached for the camera, his fingers not quite steady enough to focus properly. His reflection stood there, unblinking, watching him, an echo of everything he'd tried to hide from. "You're not real," he whispered to himself, as though repeating the words could make them true. But the reflection just tilted its head slightly, as though considering the phrase. "Real? What does that even mean, Li Hua? Isn't everything real to someone? You've spent your whole life bending light, bending people's perceptions of the world around you. You think that's truth? That's illusion, just like me." The words twisted through his mind like knots, pulling at something deep inside him. He looked away, focusing on the camera in his hands, hoping that if he could just click the shutter, if he could just snap the right shot, everything would make sense again. But when he raised the camera to his eye, the reflection didn't shift. It didn't act out of character, it just stood there, calmly observing him, as though amused by the whole spectacle. He exhaled sharply, lowering the camera. His fingers were no longer cooperating. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back. Something about this wasn't right. No amount of photos would fix it. This wasn't a problem with the light. This wasn't a problem with the mirror. This was something inside of him, something he had no control over, and for the first time in a long time, Li Hua didn't feel like the artist. He felt like the subject, trapped inside his own creation. The reflection smiled again, the same slow, knowing smile that seemed to mock every decision he'd ever made. It was as if the reflection knew what he was going to do before he did it. It wasn't just a mirror, it was a predator. "Tell me something," the reflection said, its voice softer now, almost affectionate. "How long have you been running from yourself, Li Hua? How long have you hidden behind your camera, your illusions, your endless search for meaning?" Li Hua shook his head violently, trying to clear the thoughts swirling in his mind. This couldn't be happening. He wasn't running from anything. He was an artist. He created. He controlled what people saw. But as the reflection spoke, the words landed somewhere deep inside him, in that quiet place where his most buried fears resided. He could feel it then, something pulling at him, something calling him into the mirror. He took a step toward it, without thinking, driven by some primal need to confront whatever this was, to break free from it before it broke him. But as he reached out, his fingers never touched the glass. Instead, they passed through it as though the surface of the mirror were made of water. A shudder ran through him as he jerked his hand back, suddenly aware that the line between the world he knew and the one staring back at him was no longer so distinct. The reflection didn't move. It was still standing there, unmoving, watching him, the faint smile never leaving its lips. "Come closer," it said. "Don't be afraid. You've always wanted to know what lies beyond this world. Come and see." Without thinking, Li Hua took another step forward, and this time, the world seemed to shift around him. The room around him blurred, colors warping and twisting as the edges of his reality started to bend, to melt, to crumble like the pages of a book dissolving in water. He gasped, his heart pounding, as the world around him started to fold inward. The floor beneath him gave way, the walls stretched like rubber, and for a moment, he thought he might fall into the very reflection itself. He tried to call out, but the words stuck in his throat. There was nothing but the stillness of the mirror world, a cold, suffocating silence that pressed in on all sides. "Where are you going?" the reflection asked, its voice drifting through the darkness, surrounding him. "This is where you belong, Li Hua. You've spent your life in search of meaning, but all you've ever needed was right here. It's not a world of light, of cameras and shadows. It's a world of truth." Li Hua's mind raced. He was losing himself in this place. His hands shook as he gripped the sides of his head, trying to focus, trying to find something solid in this distortion. But everything was slipping away from him. He could hear the soft hum of the lights overhead, but even they sounded far away, distant. And then, with a sudden shock, the world snapped back into focus. He was standing in his studio again, but it wasn't his studio. The layout had changed. The light was softer, warmer. The furniture, the paint on the walls, it was all different, subtly off. Even the smell of the air had changed, faintly metallic, like the air before a thunderstorm. He turned around, instinctively searching for the reflection, but it was gone. Or was it? In the corner of the room, through the window, he saw the reflection of his face, his real face, as it should be. He ran toward the glass, pressing his palm against it. But the reflection didn't move. It stayed still, like a dead thing. Only the slightest flicker of movement, his own eyes, shifting, watching him, confirmed it wasn't just his imagination. He spun back toward the mirror on the opposite wall. There, his reflection was standing again, waiting. Watching. "No," Li Hua muttered. "No more." But the reflection tilted its head again, just as it had before, a glimmer of that mocking smile spreading across its features. "You think you can escape me? You think you can leave this place? This is the world you've created, Li Hua. This is the reality you've been hiding from." His breath came fast, panic rising in his chest as he staggered back, trying to process what was happening. "I didn't make this," he whispered. "This isn't me. This is just an illusion." The reflection laughed, a low, rich laugh that sent a chill down his spine. "An illusion? Is it? Tell me, Li Hua, what's the difference between the world you live in and the one I've created for you? What if there's no difference? What if this world, this place, is just as real as anything else?" He could feel the truth of those words begin to sink in, and it terrified him. His grip on reality was slipping. What if the world around him was just a reflection, a shadow of something deeper? What if the mirror world wasn't just a trick of light, but the real version of things, the version that he was too afraid to confront? What if everything he had worked for, every photograph he had taken, was nothing but another distortion, a reflection of the fear, the doubt, the chaos that he had tried to bury for years? The reflection in the mirror grew clearer, more distinct, and now it was no longer standing passively. It was moving toward him, stepping out of the glass, one deliberate footfall after another. Its smile grew wider, and Li Hua could see the shadows of his own fear in its eyes, and they were looking back at him, cold and unblinking. "What is real, Li Hua?" it asked softly, its voice now almost tender. What is true? You've been trying to control everything around you, but what if the only thing you can control is yourself? And then, without warning, the reflection reached forward and grabbed him. For a moment, everything went white again. When the white light faded, Li Hua felt his feet on solid ground again. But the ground beneath him was strange, shifting, as if it were made of something less tangible than the floor of his studio. He looked down, but he couldn't see his feet clearly, just a blurry, swirling surface that kept pulling at him, warping like liquid glass. He staggered back, disoriented, and tried to steady himself, but the feeling of floating, of not quite being in the world, made him sick to his stomach. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. The reflection, the mirror, stood ahead of him, but it wasn't a reflection at all anymore. It was a doorway, a window into another reality. The surface of the glass rippled like water, distorting everything around it. The reflection, or rather the version of him that had been standing so confidently in the mirror, was now standing outside of it, no longer just an image, but a real, tangible presence. "Welcome back," the reflection said softly, its voice carrying through the strange space like a whisper in the wind. Its smile was unervingly calm, its eyes flickering with something dark, something familiar. "Did you really think you could escape me, Li Hua? You thought you could close your eyes and step away. But you can't. Not anymore." Li Hua swallowed hard, his mind reeling. Every instinct in him screamed to run, to get away from this thing, this other version of himself that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of reason. He backed away slowly, but the air felt thick, as though the very atmosphere was closing in around him. Every step he took only seemed to bring him closer to the reflection, as though it were pulling him in. "You can't run from yourself," the reflection continued, its tone still disturbingly gentle. "You've spent your whole life behind a lens, hiding from what you really are. You've spent so much time bending light, shaping reality, trying to create a perfect world. But in doing so, you've forgotten something. You've forgotten that the illusion was you all along." Li Hua's heart pounded in his chest. He knew this was not a simple hallucination. He knew it wasn't just a trick of the mind. This was real, in a way that was so far beyond his comprehension, it threatened to break him apart. He reached out instinctively, his hands shaking, trying to grasp the edges of reality, trying to feel something solid again, but the air rippled like water under his touch, pulling away from him, unwilling to allow him any purchase. That he closed his eyes, a wave of nausea sweeping through him. He couldn't breathe. His vision swam. And then he heard it again, that voice, like it was coming from the very center of his skull. "Look at yourself," it said. "Truly look." He opened his eyes and saw his reflection standing right in front of him, its face inches from his own. There was no longer any distance between them, no safety in the glass. They were one and the same, standing together in this strange liminal space where the laws of physics no longer applied. "You're terrified, aren't you?" the reflection murmured, its voice a caress. "You're afraid because you see the truth now. I am you, Li Hua. And you are me. The only difference is that I am everything you've hidden from. I am the part of you that you've been running from all these years. The part you've kept locked away in your art, in your images, in your obsession with light. And now it's come to take you." Li Hua gasped for air, his chest tight, his mind struggling to process the words. His thoughts felt fragmented, like pieces of a broken puzzle that couldn't be put together. But through the haze of panic, something started to form, a realization, a truth he couldn't escape. The reflection was right. It wasn't just an image. It wasn't a ghost, or a trick of light. It was the version of him that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when he would finally be forced to confront it. "You've always been the one creating your own prison, Li Hua," the reflection continued, its lips curling into that familiar, mocking smile. "You've lived in a world of shadows, convincing yourself that you're the one in control, that you're the one shaping everything around you. But now, I'm here to show you the truth. You can't control me. You can't control what's inside of you. His head spun. It felt like the world was crumbling beneath his feet, as though the very fabric of reality was being undone. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to deny it, to push back against the reflection's claims, but the more he fought, the more he felt himself slipping, like he was being drawn into the mirror itself. The reflection took a step closer, and this time, Li Hua didn't move away. He couldn't. It was like he was rooted to the spot, his body paralyzed by the pull of the other version of himself. I can make you see it, the reflection whispered. I can show you what you've been hiding from all these years. The truth of who you really are. The room seemed to blur, and suddenly Li Hua found himself standing in front of a vast, empty gallery. The walls stretched endlessly, adorned with pictures, his art, his work. But something was wrong with them. The colors were wrong. The angles were twisted. Faces in the photographs looked back at him, but their eyes were wrong, blank, hollow, lifeless. The people in his photos weren't smiling anymore. They were staring at him, accusing him, as if they knew something he didn't. Do you see it now? The reflection asked, its voice ringing in his ears like a bell tolling in the distance. You created this. You've spent so much time trying to control the light, trying to control the way the world looks, but look at the chaos it's brought you. This is the real world, Li Hua. Not the one you try to control. Not the one you capture through your lens. This is the world you've been hiding from. Li Hua's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to push the photos away, to deny the twisted, distorted versions of reality he saw in front of him. But he couldn't. The photographs were his, after all. They were his creations. They were the images he had manipulated, the light he had shaped, the illusions he had constructed. He had spent his life creating them, convincing himself that they were perfect, that they represented something pure. But now they were haunting him. The reflection smiled, stepping forward. You've built a world of illusions, Li Hua. And now, I'm going to show you the truth. He tried to turn away, to escape, but the reflection's hand shot out, grabbing his arm with an unexpected force. Li Hua gasped as he felt the grip tighten, pulling him back toward the gallery. No, he shouted, struggling to break free, but it was no use. His reflection's grip was stronger than anything he could muster. You can't escape me, the reflection said softly, as though it were a simple truth. You are me. And then, with one final tug, Li Hua was pulled forward into the center of the gallery, and the world collapsed around him. The silence that followed was deafening. Li Hua stood alone, in a darkness so complete it felt like it was pressing down on him from all sides. There were no sounds, no lights, no shapes or forms, just an infinite, all-consuming nothing, and then, as though summoned by his thoughts, a light flickered to life ahead of him. It wasn't a light he had created. It wasn't a light he had controlled. It was something different, something pure, something real. The light grew, expanding around him, brightening the darkness, until Li Hua could see the outlines of the gallery once again. But this time, the photographs were different. They were no longer distorted. They were no longer twisted versions of reality. They were real. Li Hua stepped forward, his hands trembling as he reached out for one of the photos. He looked at the image, the same image he had created so many times, the same photograph he had always believed was perfect. But this time, it was different. This time, the light felt right. This time, the world felt true, and for the first time in his life, Li Hua understood. He wasn't the one who had created the illusions. He wasn't the one who had bent the light. He had been a part of it all along. That he wasn't just the photographer. He was the subject.